Are you currently working on a project? Do you have anything here? Maybe here's a double part question. Are any of your books in kind of a connected world? Like, do you have like a series or anything? And if not, like, is there a reason for that? Or
Under Carrow Brown, all my stories are in a Carrowverse, or I call it a clusterverse because it's a clusterfuck in there, right?
Mhm.
But at some point, it's all tied together. It just may not be in the exact same timeline, kind of thing.
Right.
In regards to what I have in the works right now, so like this sounds like I have a lot going on, and I do, but I write, I edit, I also ghostwrite, which is an interesting experience. I finished ghostwriting this year a trilogy for a client, and I'm waiting for the client to finish reviewing it right now
Mhm.
before I go back and edit it because it's not my property, right? So I need
Right.
them to tell me what they want to change before I can finalize it.
Mhm.
And so what I'm doing right now is, because that was kind of like a contemporary story, I've presently switched my brain into something sci-fi.
Mhm.
So that way when I go back to it, it'll be like a complete refresh and I'm not like super immersed in it.
Mhm.
And I even changed the medium on that too, because so the client project was long form, which is industry talk for novels. And
Mhm.
so what I was writing is a script right now. And when you do a lot of writing, sometimes like flipping back and forth like that is a good reset. Other people just like don't write for a month. I don't know how you do that,
Yeah.
but you do.
Yeah. I like having a few projects to switch between.
Hmm.
Just like, because sometimes I'll be writing something and I get stuck, and then I'm like, I don't know how to fix this. So for the series I'm writing, I have a few planned later. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll jump and I'll write like a scene in a future book that probably maybe I'll never even use, but it
Hmm.
just kind of jogs my brain a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I think Stephen King in his book called that Men in the Basement, where when you ask them to move other things, it makes stuff fall into place where it needs to be.
Yeah. Do you find switching genres can be difficult? Like if you're writing, like a literary fiction, then you go to, sci-fi back to romance. Like, can it be jarring, or do you handle that pretty well?
I feel like I handle it pretty well, although I will say probably with the romance, it's a little bit more of a lighthearted tone. So when I go back into it with like, my serious sci-fi horror stuff and like I get the narrative in there, I'll usually catch myself being like, delete, 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 try
Yeah.
again. So
Yeah.
that's probably the friction point on that.
Yeah. What's I haven't talked to anyone about ghostwriting, so obviously you probably can't say anything about your clients or whatever, but what is how did you get into ghostwriting, and then what's kind of the process of that?
So what happened with that was, I've been publishing since 2019, right? And I've not been shy about putting my books out there. And what happened was somebody approached me before my current client, and they were kind of like, "Hey, I've read some of your work. I can't write. Literally, could not write. Right? Like, did not have the physical means to write."
Right.
But they were like, "Can you, if I tell you what I'm looking for, can you go ahead and like make it for me?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, I can do that."
Yeah.
Right. And so that's kind of how I initially got into ghostwriting. That was like a short story. I typed it, made like $50, and that was the start of it, right? With this particular client, they did review my work, obviously, because they wanted to see if my writing style matched the theme of what they were looking for. And when we started having talks, I was like, what are three other books that you want this book to be comparable to? So they gave me those three books. I read those three books, right? Because if you're going to write for a particular audience, it's always good to know what it is that that audience reads as well. So I read that, I made some notes, and then I had a meeting with them to go over like the general outline of what they were going for. And my last client was actually really nice because they just kind of like let the reins go and like said, have fun, right?
Hmm.
I had a lot of fun,
Yeah.
a lot.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But the longer part is I have to wait for them to get through it. And I wrote three books. They're anywhere between 100 and 115,000 words long. So
Wow.
so they're not just going to read it like tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right.
It's going to take a little while.
Yeah. And the reason I did it that way and the reason I pitched it that way was because there was three books in the series. And I said, if I write something in book three that I want to have a breadcrumb for earlier, it's best that we don't have that book published so I can do all the jumping around that I need to do then.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you wrote them all at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, I wrote them in order. I wrote book
Yeah.
one, book two, book three, but it's book three where it ends up going back and having to plant like those Easter eggs before.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's honestly I thought that was a lot of fun. I also had to like check in and be like, I want to do this. And they're like, we don't know about that. It's like, pretty thing.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an author, Michael J. Sullivan. Have you heard of him? He was the first one I've seen that openly talks about this anyways, where like he says in the beginning of his book that he writes his series. So he did like a 5-book series. He writes all of it before he publishes any of it. And I was like, man, that is so cool to me, because you can do that. You can go back and be like, okay, hey, there's a thing in book 4 that I want to, put something in book 1. And I just think it's smart. I think it's probably hard, but smart.
It's easier. What's hard is when you write book 1 and then you do stuff in book 2 and it wasn't in book 1, right?
And you can't change it.
Yeah, you can't change it. Like, I hate saying this, but like Dune, right? For example. Yeah. So like in Dune 1, which, great legacy book right there.
Yeah.
It was very bare bones in terms of like interpersonal relationships, right? But then we get into book 2 and suddenly it's like, oh man, my best friend is dead. I can't deal with this. And it was like, you didn't give 2 tosses in book 1 about your best friend that's dead. Like,
yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I think a good example too would be Harry Potter. Like there's a lot of things in that where I think she had like a lot of the bones and like kind of the structure of how she wanted the story to go and like the ending. But there's definitely a lot of details where it's kind of like, that's a retcon and that doesn't quite fit.
Yeah,
and
I don't remember that.
Yeah, there's a couple of, especially when you get some of the magic bits and then they talk about earlier stuff. And I'm like, that doesn't quite.
Yeah, that didn't happen.
Yeah, that didn't really happen that way. So, well, I think it's really cool. So how long did those 3 take you then?
About 5 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then was that like did you write it once and then send it back? Or did you kind of write it once, go over it again, do a few drafts, or just kind of first draft?
So what I did was I wrote the entire first draft of book 1 and then I sent it, and then I was like, do you want me to wait? Like, what do you want to do? And then they get back to me right away. So I was like, I'm going to just go, right? Like I just kept going. Because, I mean, even if I had to change smaller details, like the meat of the story would still be there. So if I have to go back and like do like a bunch of tiny revisions, that's fine. But yeah, so it took me about 5 months, and then I would send it in chunks. And yeah. So I think some people like it by chapters, but I would say if you can do like the whole project at once, then go ahead and do it that way.
Yeah. I really like how Brandon Sanderson's been structuring his Stormlight archive novels. I don't know if you've read any of those.
I'm a big Sanderson fan, but that is not the one I've gotten into yet. I've been I challenged myself to read The Dark Tower. Yeah. I haven't finished it.
I just finished Tress of the Emerald Sea, which was
that was good.
My gosh, it was so good. It was so just whimsical, to use your word from before. Like it was just such a light, fun story.
Yeah, I really did like the fairy tale narrative style that he used in that. I thought that was beautiful, and I really liked. It was like I have the book right there, but I really, even though there was like one part where I was like, I think I know what that is. I think it's this thing. But even though I kind of predicted what that twist was going to be, I was still satisfied by it, which is it's a good way to say that you wrote it really well. Yeah.
Yeah, the Stormlight books, they're kind of broken up into like, it's like each book has like 5 parts. So, but I like that because they're so long. I'm a slow reader too. So like they're so long that it's kind of it's like 5 books in one. So you can kind of like, okay, I read part 1. So I can like take a break for a minute and read part 2. And yeah, I just like how he's everything he does is very intentional. It feels like.
It is, yeah. No, he knows exactly what he's doing when he goes in there. I still remember. I don't know if you know like his full history, but he's like really big on like the hard magic system, which we all know about. But what's funny is that we all found that out when he went on a panel to talk about magic systems. He's like, "No, you should tell your entire audience how it works." And all the other authors on the panel were like, "No, you fool!"
Yeah, yeah. And then here he is being like the biggest fantasy author right now ever.